Nick Saito. Next member of government is Mr. Edward. Government Whip, Ryo Hayakawa. On the opposition side, the leader opposition, Amy Howe. Member of opposition, Miss Amina. Opposition side whip, Mitsushi Ono. The motion of this model debate is this House would completely ban broadcasting of suicide. First, I call upon Prime Minister, please deliver a constructive speech within 4 minutes. Here.
We say that it's the fundamental nature of media to try to sensationalize the stories that they cover in order to make profit. We don't think that this is because the people at the media companies are bad people, but we think that's just what's in their interest, right? And we say that the sensationalization that's created by the very nature of media is going to bring around severe harms that we'd like to circumvent. Before I move on to that argument, let's just clarify what we support. Now, we support the ban of any explicit portrayal of suicide on any form of media. This includes social media, includes TV, so on and so forth. Now, let's just move right on to our first argument about the sensationalization in media. We say that the fundamental nature of media is that they're a profit-seeking entity in the first place, right? We say that getting viewer rates, clicks, shares, likes, whatever it is, all lead to money, which is the #1 goal of these media companies. We see, this nature come to play, for example, when we see media sources that are supposed to be telling truth using titles that are clickbaity, titles that capture attention, titles that are extremely over-exaggerated, right? And we say that this affect the coverage of suicide in a variety of ways. We say that generally speaking, when suicide is covered by the media, especially because the media has to make a profit off of that story, it tends to paint the victim as the hero of the story, depicting the victim as a victim, as just that, like a victim of tragic circumstances, being forced into suicide by evil bullies and by unfortunate circumstances. We very rarely see in media a story of a suicide that demonizes the suicide victim, or even to a lesser extent, that actually accurately captures the circumstances of the suicide. Yes?
If sensationalization is a criteria for censorship, then we have to ban all broadcasting of any information conveyed to the public. What do you think about it, and where do you draw the line?
We say that will be dealt with in the second speaker's argument, which is going to be about how I'm not lying, which is going to be about how there are precedents to the government taking measures against sensationalization and why that needs to be done. Okay, note that that the sensationalization of coverage of suicide in media is particularly impactful because the suicide stories that make the top, right, that make it into the media tend to be that of high-profile pictures, right? Nobody really cares if there's someone in the middle of nowhere who committed suicide, and that's not going to get you views. We say that generally speaking, media tends to focus on individuals who are high-profile, people who tend to have a lot of fans so that they can attract attention. We say that examples of place all over the place, right? And we say that two issues arise from this. The first is that the glorification and sensationalization of suicide pushes people who are already suicidal toward further depression, right? And we say that people who watch media like this in the first place tend to be the people who are attracted to news stories about suicide are often suicidal in the first place. We say this adds pressure to an already irrational person. It legitimizes the choice that they're working about, right? Especially because generally speaking, whenever you talk to someone, you're like, hey, I'm feeling suicidal, the automatic response is to go, okay, calm down, let's not kill yourself, right? And we say that these people are always searching for a reason to commit suicide. They're searching for something that legitimizes their choice, right? And we say that particularly when the media tells them that committing suicide is a good thing and that good things can come out of it, that people will respect protect you and love you and miss you if you commit suicide, we say that this legitimizes that choice that otherwise would not have done so. Note especially here that considering that accessibility is a big barrier to suicide, right? Not actually knowing how to commit suicide, not having an exact plan for what you do when you commit suicide is often a big barrier, right? Knowing that, okay, this is how suicide happens, and this is how it goes down, and knowing what you have to do, the actual steps you have to pass through to commit suicide is a very big barrier. Secondly, we say that this often harms and tortures the family who has already been forced to live through hell, right? Particularly note here that the media tends to infringe on their privacy and go into their houses to interview them, right? We don't think that it's fair to put the family through this, considering that, their loved ones have committed suicide already. It's unfortunate circumstances. Let's not make it any worse. We are very happy to report.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Next, I call upon leader opposition. Please deliver a constructive speech within 4 minutes. Here.
Wow, I feel like I'm gonna throw up now. Okay. Is suicide good or bad? In liberal democratic countries, it's not the government's job to decide, however, it's rather an individual choice and its value. So today we are happy to oppose this motion, and I'd like to talk about a couple of things, and all my rebuttals are included in my speech. So, firstly, I'd like to talk about the principle of the problem, and secondly, my honorable partner is going to talk about the practical harm. So, first point that we'd like to talk about is that democracy has informed debate about suicide with lots of information from all sorts of various sources. No, thank you. And reason for this, number one, diverse information from all sorts of places is important. We need to have documentary, we need to have news, we need to have journalism to analyze the cause of the suicide. For example, we need to find out why bullying happened, why people committed suicide because of the bullying or the exploitation or discrimination. All sorts of reasons cause the suicide. We need to find out the cause of it, and we need to talk about it, and we need to analyze it. That's why we need to talk about it, okay?
First of all, how do you guarantee that the information spread by media sources is accurate? And second of all, how do you guarantee that the people contemplating suicide are in a rational mindset and can make their own choices?
Okay, so under the status quo, the information that's going around is not accurate. There are some accurate and reliable sources, but there are other fake news and there are lots of information. So what's important is to collect all the information, and we need to create the social discourse, and we need to talk about it. That's the important point. So that's why we need to talk about it. No, thank you. Okay, the reason number two, based on this information we collect, society can decide what to do, as I mentioned. So let's take a look at the example of then two examples. The worker committed suicide, and that was broadcasted big time. And because of that, government intervened. And because of that, the company changed the way of the company's working conditions. And without that report, nothing happened. So the social discourse can change the society, and that for better, and that's more important. But hiding the information or not broadcasting information, there would be no discourse, no social changes. So there is no universal answer to what to do about the suicide. Okay, so I'd like to talk about reason number three. Okay, suicide is a moral issue. Okay, so there's no universal answer what to do about it. However, silence is not the answer. Silence doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so government, we should not shut down. Government should not shut down. Rather, provide information to all the people. And government cannot decide arbitrarily. And reason number four, that's why autonomy of media, freedom of media is important. The state cannot censor all the information, and that by censoring the information, that creates rather dangerous precedents for the future. So a state cannot manipulate the public discourse. For all these reasons, we are happy to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader Opposition. Next, I call upon Member of Government. Please deliver a constructive speech within 4 minutes. Here.
Okay, so let me just start with some rebuttal on the arguments that we've just heard from the Leader of the Opposition. Now, to begin with, and I'll quote from the Leader of the Opposition's speech, under the status quo, the information we get is not accurate. Okay, this is fairly damning for the Opposition's case. As it currently stands, the information that we receive about suicide, it comes from extremely glorified and sensationalized reports, and as they admit, is not and cannot be considered accurate. Now, we consider that that is not an acceptable state of affairs for an issue that is so terminal for our lives. We exist in a crisis. Now, a second piece of rebuttal, which leads nicely on to the main point of my argument, which I will keep brief given our 4-minute speeches, which is that it's true, the issue of suicide is obviously a moral judgment, but it was claimed that in a liberal democracy it's not for the government to decide one way or the other whether suicide is right or wrong. But what we say actually is that in a liberal democracy, governments have rights and they have responsibilities. And it is the responsibility of the government to ensure a status of care for its citizens, which means if a citizen of that state is going to actively harm or kill themselves, it is the duty of the government to step in and prevent that harm from coming to pass. This, we believe, is the core of our argument. We don't accept that the government can wash its hands of its responsibilities. Okay, why do we not accept this? Well, we don't accept it for the reason that in a situation where we have sensationalization of suicide, and we have the risk that portrayal of suicide is going to increase suicide rates, and we know this because there are two main factors which contribute to the increase in suicide. One of them is access, and one of them is direct exposure to other suicides. So we already know that under the status quo, when we have these sensationalized reports, we very much risk the possibility that more suicides are going to keep occurring. Now, with that in mind, what can we infer? We can infer that if the government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, which we argue it clearly does, because it cannot and does not, under the status quo, allow its citizens to die freely, just one moment, to die freely in the streets, it is therefore the responsibility of the government to ensure that coverage of suicide is not sensationalized, and so we do not experience increased suicides. I'll take that point now.
A government has limited resources. On the topic of suicide prevention, is the duty of care not better fulfilled by investing in preventative healthcare, education programs in schools, and social work rather than censoring the media?
This is an interesting point, but I would just point out that the case we heard from your former speaker was that it's not actually the business of the government to decide whether suicide is good or bad, and under that logic, I would fail to see why the government would be invested in preventative measures when it clearly takes no position. Now, what do I summarise from this? I summarise that the government has a duty of care. Suicide presents, obviously, a real and present threat to human life. Under the current condition of sensationalised news, that threat is going to grow. Therefore, we suggest that the government must regulate the information to save the lives of its citizens, which we have established it has a right to do under a crisis that we've also established is about to get worse. For that reason, I've never been more proud to propose a motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member of Government. Next, I'll call upon Member of Opposition. Please deliver a constructive speech within 4 minutes. Here.
Good evening, my name is Amina, and I'm very proud to be talking from opposition. So, in this speech, I'm going to bring you 3 arguments. 1, why broadcasting is an incredibly powerful medium that can change the discourse and does change the discourse for the better. 2, I'm going to talk about the harm of silence and why a complete ban does not answer the question. And number 3, I'm going to extend on the idea of the remit of the government and censorship of information. But first, I'd like to start with 2 main points of rebuttal. 1, why the government has failed to say why a ban is the best course of action versus restrictions, guidelines, or regulation. And 2, while we can fulfill a duty of care without resorting to censoring information. Now, I'd like to start with a bit of a parable. My friend Eddie here is a very reasonable man. He's very intelligent and he's very clever. And I had the answer to my POI, posting the question, Eddie, how often do you read a tabloid? And the answer is not too often. He's a broadsheet, which is a kind of man, which is, you know, a educated, balanced newspaper, or other sources. And the point I'm trying to get at here is a sensationalization in the media is a long-term harm. This is the structure of our media being profit-motivated and having private media outlets. The answer is not a complete ban, but actually changing the structures of our media and delivery. That's a separate debate. But the point here is the fact that for every tabloid, for every sensationalist paper, there is a man like Eddie reading broadsheets and balanced papers. We can see this with the films that have emerged about the Me Too movement. Films 100 Years a Slave, The Danish Girl, Invictus. Powerful parts of intelligent media that have changed the discourse, and they are visual, they are emotive, and they are immediate. You don't get this in other types of information sharing, where it is particularly needed when we think about sensitive topics like suicide, because it allows you to emotionally connect with a group or that you may not otherwise have a shared lived experience with. When we say one of the major problems about suicide is social isolation, surely we should be doing what we can to promote empathy, to learn from the past and what has happened, to change social structures. Yes, I'll take your point.
When these people are so alone and suicidal, do you think they're going to read reasonable newspapers that talk about the pros and cons of suicide, or are they going to run towards something that justifies their ideologies?
Thank you for your point. I am not necessarily talking about directly reaching out to victims. We concede that these people are often vulnerable and irrational. We're saying what actually works in preventing suicide, and it is strong social networks. It is resilience. It is friendship groups, and it's having people there in the first place. Why do so many victims end up alone or vulnerable or irrational? It's because they didn't have these support networks. What we're advocating is the best way you can achieve duty of care and prevention is through building strong social networks, and we say a strong way to do this is through broadcasting and is through having these stories. And we say the harms we hear about sensationalization are not unique to this issue. It's the same thing with radicalization, other sensitive topics. On our side of the house, we're not against guidelines. Things like SNS or Facebook. I know, thank you. Things like SNS or Facebook guidelines that are there to regulate discussion. We're not against this. What we're saying, as our first speaker said, is that the government doesn't have a role in shutting down discourse because silence only creates more stigma. And preventing people from knowing what really happens and from knowing the true experience of someone else. You can't sugarcoat it. It's a tough issue. We concede this. What we say is we need tough conversations to combat it. Thank you.
Thank you, member of opposition. Next, I'd like to call upon government whip. Please deliver whip speech within 4 minutes. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think it is justifiable to scapegoat those who are vulnerable or prone to influence or manipulation by these sensational information for discourse. Because obviously discourse itself is not a tangible result that the society should look after, especially when there are tangible or substantial alternatives to address those issues directly. With that being the stance from inside government, I'm going to discuss two issues as the web speaker. Number one, I'm going to address the purpose of broadcasting, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the specificities of the kind of information which would be delivered to the public and how people would be reacting to this. Now moving on to the first flashpoint. Number one, we heard this ridiculous point from leader opposition saying that suicide is an individual fundamental choice. We doubt the premise for the following two reasons. Number one, if this is a choice which is such important and fundamental, why we are not teaching these things in mandatory education as a valid choice? We don't do so because of the following reasons. The government obviously is responsible for sustaining the society because it is the foundation of everybody from living safely and happily. No thank you. That's why the government also provides child care leave support or monetary incentivizes families to have children, because obviously less children would lead to not sustaining the society itself. And that's why we think that, especially when there is information which is so sensational that this may entice people from committing suicide, we think that these information should not come out. Secondly, they have said that analysis of suicide is necessary for discourse. We doubt this. We doubt their conclusion of, no thank you, having this information out into the public just for people to understand it. We see various examples like classified military information of military operation or details of TPP was not being disclosed to the public. Because when we see substantial potential of people reacting in a visceral manner so that they would likely to make an emotional rush choice, we also think that information should be regulated or even being banned from coming out to the society. That being the first issue, I'm going to move on to the second flash. Now, yes. Go ahead.
I had three. On the idea of, I think you're misrepresenting our case. We have not said total graphic divulgence of sensitive information. We're talking about, stories that are given, any other, violent. In the UK, we have the watershed, or we have different warning messages or limits on what can be shown. We're not removing these.
Okay, I think I sort of understood. So I think I'm going to respond to that in what I'm going to talk about from right now. So their main argument from the leader of opposition is that this incident would be silenced if we don't have an explicit portrayal of suicide, but by not taking this proposal. But we don't really think that suicide itself should be broadcasted, which when we can address these issues in other ways. For example, Dentsu issue was a clear problem with the working condition itself. And bullying cases is a problem of bullying, and we don't really have to say that suicide was being involved. We all know that bad working conditions are bad. We also have different sources of information directly addressing these problems. DLO just name-dropped different things. We don't really think that there was a proper justification on that. And they have been extremely dismissive to what we have told you of sensational information enticing people to commit certain acts. I'm going to give you an example of Shonen A letter, which was a violent murder of small children by a teenager guy. So when the letter of Shonen A was published in the media, what we thought about his crime or why he thought it was a cool thing to commit these crime, actually this created many followers who also tried or actually committed violent criminals. So we see a substantial potential of enticing people to mimic or copy these kinds of actions, and because we see a more tangible and likelihood scenario on side affirmative, you should vote for our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. Next, I'll call upon opposition side whip. Please deliver whip speech within 4 minutes. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the floor. I don't know how many times I make a speech here at this specific podium. I would like to answer two questions in my speech. First of all, what kind of information are conveyed to public? Secondly, how democracy should conclude the moral dispute on suicide and the specific choice. First question, what kind of information are actually conveyed to public in the status realistically? Their main condition is sensationalization. Two responses. One, that's unrealistic depiction of the status quo to say that all information is sensationalized and objectified and commercialized to a radical extent. There's oftentimes a downside of the debate and upside of the debate. For example, when the Netflix original drama, 30 Reasons Why, was broadcasted in Netflix, there was a huge discussion about discouragement of suicide rather than encouragement of the suicide. And that's a natural public reaction. There's always a countervailing view or counter-discourse about it. No, thank you. Secondly, even if some information are sensationalized, that's good. Because that's an effective strategy to get attention from the public. That's an effective solution to attract and gravitate attention from the public. And Riku Prime Minister conceded that otherwise people become ignorant and stay ignorant. If that's a realistic context, the only solution to galvanize discourse and activate public discussion is to sensationalize information and make this information relevant to people as much as possible. And that's the solution from this side of the house, rather than shutting down everything. Finally, on this is about the accuracy of information. The second speaker's concern is about the accuracy of information. Let's make a comparison between their paradigm and our paradigm. If we ban all this kind of information, how teenagers get information? Maybe they will access websites, an individual blog, or Twitter. These teenagers are more likely to access even more unqualified information compared to the status quo. But at least we have broadcasting corporations in the status quo that have editorial capacity to make sure the quality of information and accuracy of information is guaranteed. So if we make this kind of comparison, the accuracy of information is rather undermined on their side of the house. Before moving on to the second point, I'd like to take a point from Riku, I think, rather than you. You don't have? If you have, maybe I'll take it later. Moving on to the next point. Okay, you go ahead.
Again, if you're talking about giving normal or informed, good information to people who are lonely and depressed, what's the guarantee that these people are not going to commit suicide, right? These people want these sensationalized media so that they can justify their own views.
First answer is, I cannot say there's no guarantee, because this is a debate about media and information. There is no the perfect tangibility or relevancy, and that's not a justification for censorship anyway. The same question can be thrown back at them. If you want to justify a censorship, you have to prove that it's always a perfect linkage to between information and actual consequence of that individual. So if you think that's the burden of proof, you haven't fulfilled your burden of proof as well. Moving on to the second question of this debate, how democracy should conclude the debate, a moral debate about suicide. My first contention is the suicide is a moral issue. There's no universal answer about what to do with. Therefore, and they acknowledge the state is responsible for protecting the individual. State has a responsibility to make a compensation for this kind of injustice. We agree that we can see that. If that logic is true, how should we compensate for this kind of social injustice? How should we compensate for this disastrous circumstance that people confront every day? Their answer is shut down discourse, and silence is the solution. We don't believe so. If state is all responsibility and is able to compensate, then our answer is to let the society decide. Let everybody decide what to do about it, and that's the democracy's principle that we defend on our side of the house. Finally, about the triggering effect. This is not relevant to the debate. If triggering effect is a criterion for the censorship, then you have to censor every single information that is conveyed to society. But that's not the answer to that information. If there is harmful information, the answer is to create a counter-discourse to balance out. That's how we enable individuals to strike the best balance about what kind of information they gain and they access to. And therefore, we are happy to defend on freedom of media and autonomy and independence of the media. We are happy to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, opposition side whip. Next, I'll call upon reply speaker from opposition side. Please deliver reply speech within 3 minutes. Here.
I'll remember to look at my clock this time. Well, it is a pleasure and a privilege to be summing and replying speech from my wonderful team, who I really just want to accentuate and reinforce what they have said. So we come down to sort of two main clashes in this debate. We concede on both sides that we want to help those who are vulnerable to committing suicide or finding themselves in the conditions that lead to such actions. Where we dissipate and move away from each other is the idea, the principle of paternalism versus the principle of liberty and self-determination. And we've looked at the risks and the harms from both sides. And what we can hear from this side is that the paternalism is not justified. The idea of complete ban, for what it represents in terms of silencing the discourse, for what it represents in terms of a subjective moral agenda coming under the remit of a government, and therefore the implications in the future for what might be censored, for information that might be withheld based on an arbitrary metric, and for the fact that it doesn't actually change the situation for the victims. The fact that it doesn't actually change what they're going through and the people that are already in that scenario. And the fourth fact, that it drives the conversation underground. We can see this time and time again when we shut down a discussion. We can look at it within the political realm. When we start removing certain political voices, it drives them underground into the unregulated, into the unprotected, into the unedited, which holds people more vulnerable. So that's why we say the paternalism on this side doesn't have a justification, and why we uphold the values of a liberal democracy where information should be available to the citizens. Because once we start en masse doubting the capabilities and the rationality of our citizens, we move towards a very dangerous place on the political spectrum. We say, in the most extreme characterization on both sides of the House, upholding self-determination is the best thing we can do. Because once we start removing people's agency, once we stop allowing people to make decisions for themselves, this also starts leading to silence and people not being able to stand up for themselves, which leads to the same social conditions people find themselves in when they're being bullied and unable to reach out, when they find themselves being exploited at work and unable to reach out. There's a recurring theme here, and we say on this principle, and unique to this topic, this is why we cannot silence the discourse. This is why the stigma created by silence, and this ban is not justified. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, reprise speaker from opposition side. Lastly, I call upon reprise speaker from government side. Please deliver reprise speech within 3 minutes. Here.
Okay, wonderful. It's my pleasure to close this debate for all of you. Now, before I get into the points of clash, I'd quickly like to deal with one issue that came up in the kind of firebrand whip speech that we hear, and then this kind of summing up that we get from the final speech, which is that what we really need to solve suicide is discourse, right? Through talking, we will solve the serious mental illness that causes suicide in the vast number of cases. Through talking, we will be able to solve these deep-rooted socioeconomic problems. We say that we are wary of talking when lives other than our own are on the line. What we also need to do in tandem is act, right? Discourse alone is not enough to solve a problem. You also must take proactive steps to protect people and to ensure that their lives are able to continue for long enough so that your discourse can actually be effective. Right, on to the points of clash. I argue that there are two. Firstly, the role of government. What role does government play? We on this side, we are not particularly bothered about returning to a Wild West style of government, right? We believe that the government has a role in the lives of its citizens, and in fact, it should be involved in ensuring both the lives and livelihoods of their citizens, and also moderating to a certain degree the information and the lifestyles that its citizens receive and live. We don't believe that this is a particularly radical suggestion as it's been presented, and that in actual fact, in the status quo, the government is involved in this to a large degree. It's why you are unlikely to turn on your evening news and see scenes of, for example, a drug addict injecting heroin into themselves, right? We see that the government is already involved in setting these regulations, and all we are saying is that in this particular extreme case, it should go one step further and ban that. So that's our first statement. Now, where does this lead us onto the media? Now, what we have argued throughout is that the media sensationalizes suicides. This has two major effects. One, it makes people on the brink of suicide more likely to commit suicide, because it was said that I did not prove the link, but I believe I did. I've given you the two reasons that people are often pushed over the edge in suicide. That's access and direct exposure to portrayal of suicides. We believe that link has in fact been proved, right? So we see that there is a direct threat to livelihood from the status quo as it stands, and that requires not just discourse, but action. So there's the beginning of our media. But also we believe that through this sensationalism, the issues cannot be properly understood. And the opposition talks so desperately about wanting a discourse to solve suicide, but then at the same time they seem to want to promote this media, which we believe, we have shown quite clearly, and we can all see observably, is sensationalized. And the example came up at 13 Reasons Why, which is an interesting example because it received so much criticism because it broke one of the key rules, which is that it portrayed suicide, and that led directly to increased copycat suicides, and that is wrong, and that is what we are seeking to oppose. We question the use of that example. Therefore, we believe that on those 2 points of clashes, we have made significant strides to show you how action can be used in tandem with discourse to help solve this problem, and how the government can step in to avert this crisis. It's been an honour to speak with you this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now all speeches are all over. Thank you very much for your nice cooperation. Please give them a big hand. Now audition